You were taught that slavery was about labor, about chains, about fields. But what if the real crime was hidden inside the womb? What if children were being born in Alabama who didn't fit human rules, and history erased them before you ever had a chance to ask why? Because this wasn't an accident. It wasn't folklore. It wasn't bad genetics. These births kept happening. Different plantations, different mothers, same horrifying pattern. Faces that plantation owners called animal. Bodies they still claimed as property. And every single time, the father vanished from the record. Not missing, protected. Ask yourself this. What kind of system sees a child born wrong and doesn't ask who did this, but instead asks how do we hide it? Here's what no textbook explains. Plantations weren't just labor camps. They were closed laboratories. No witnesses. No accountability. Total control over women, bloodlines, and silence. Doctors noticed patterns. Midwives learned when not to speak. And powerful men learned something far more dangerous. That if you control truth long enough, you control reality itself. Tonight, I'm going to take you into that buried system, into the births Alabama tried to erase, as to why the fathers were never named. This isn't a story meant to entertain you. It's meant to awaken something, because once you see how deep this went, you'll realize this wasn't about the past. It was about perfecting control. They didn't call them human when they were born. That was the first lie. Because language is always the system's first weapon. In the back rooms of Alabama plantations, where heat pressed against the lungs like a hand and silence was enforced harder than law, children entered the world who shattered the rules men depended on. Midwives froze. Doctors hesitated. Overseers crossed themselves and ordered doors shut. These infants cried like humans, bled like humans, clung to life with unmistakably human will. Yet their faces unsettled everyone who looked too long. Features distorted. Bone structures are unfamiliar. Expressions that felt misaligned with expectation. The official explanation was superstition. Animal-faced, they whispered. Marked, punished by God. But superstition doesn't repeat with precision. It doesn't follow patterns across counties. It doesn't respect property lines. This was something else. The births appeared scattered, far enough apart to avoid immediate suspicion, close enough to form a rhythm. Different plantations, different enslaved women. Same quiet response from the system every time. No investigation, no inquiry, no father named. The child was either hidden, sold, or erased from the record entirely. Ledgers changed, dates blurred, names vanished. Here's the part history refuses to slow down for you. A system built on ownership cannot tolerate anomalies. Anything that threatens the illusion of order must be neutralized, not loudly, not dramatically, but efficiently. When a child is born, that forces uncomfortable questions. The question itself becomes the enemy. Doctors in the region noticed things they were not paid to notice. Bone proportions that didn't match known deformities. Facial structures that defied existing medical classifications. These were not random defects. They were consistent deviations. And consistency is never accidental. Here's the part history refuses to slow down for you. A system built on ownership cannot tolerate anomalies. Anything that threatens the illusion of order must be neutralized, not loudly, not dramatically, but efficiently. When a child is born, that forces uncomfortable questions. The question itself becomes the enemy. Doctors in the region noticed things they were not paid to notice. bone proportions that didn't match known deformities, facial structures that defied existing medical classifications. These were not random defects. They were consistent deviations. And consistency is never accidental. But every man who saw the pattern also understood the boundary. Ask the wrong question, and you don't just lose your career. You become the problem the system solves next. So observations were written in private journals, in coded language, in margins that could later be denied. The enslaved mothers were never asked for explanations. They were instructed. Silence wasn't requested, it was assumed. In a world where a woman's body was already property, the origin of her child was not her story to tell. And the father's? The absence is the evidence. In any society obsessed with lineage, blood purity, and inheritance, an unnamed father is not a mystery. It's a shield. Someone important enough to be protected. Someone whose access crossed plantations. Someone whose actions would collapse reputations, markets, and myths if exposed. What you're about to hear isn't folklore. It's the shadow side of power doing what power always does when biology threatens hierarchy. It closes ranks. It controls the narrative. And it teaches everyone watching exactly how dangerous the truth can be. Dr. Elias Thorne was no stranger to the brutal realities of the South, but nothing in his medical training had prepared him for what he stumbled upon in those Alabama backwoods. A man of science, a seeker of facts. He had been summoned repeatedly to deliver babies and treat the sick across plantations where whispers were more deadly than bullets. Yet, the pattern he found, the red hair, the translucent pale skin, the eerie consistency, was a puzzle that gnawed at his reason. The first birth that haunted him was at Beaumont Plantation. Clara, a young enslaved woman, labored for hours under unbearable heat. When the child emerged, the shock wasn't just the intense red of her hair. It was the unnatural contrast against her mother's dark skin, her almost ghostly pallor, and that face, too strange to fit any medical textbook. Clara's eyes held exhaustion, relief, and a shadow of fear that Thorne couldn't explain. He asked about the father. The question hung in the thick air, but the answer was always the same: "Don't know, sir." A silence that spoke volumes. Not ignorance, but deliberate erasure. This wasn't an isolated incident. Months later, at Oak Haven Plantation, another child was born with the same fiery hair and pale skin, the same absence of paternal identity. And then a third, a fourth, until 17 such births were quietly documented across 6 plantations. 17 children, each an unspoken testament to a hidden reality. Thorne's medical curiosity became an obsession. He scoured his records, his texts, his growing ledger of anomalies. No known genetic mutation, no environmental factor could explain this haunting regularity. The science was a blunt instrument here, unable to carve through the layers of secrecy. And then came the undeniable truth, the only conclusion that made sense yet filled him with dread. These children shared a father. Not a random, distant ancestor, but one man, a white man with red hair, access to plantations, and power enough to silence questions forever. This man wasn't just a figure in Thorne's mind. He was a pillar of the community, Alastair Finch. The cotton broker with the booming voice, the bright copper hair, the man whose presence seemed to fill every room. A man who was both worshipped and feared. Imagine the twisted calculus. A man whose word was law, whose desires crossed every boundary. leaving a string of broken lives hidden behind the veils of plantation walls. The faces of his children were a secret known but unspoken, a shadow beneath the surface of Southern society. Thorne understood the stakes. To confront Finch was to risk everything: his practice, his reputation, even his life. Yet, to ignore it was to become complicit in a system designed to protect men like Finch at all costs. This is the poison beneath the honey of history, the truth that fractures the myths of honor, progress, and civilization. You are now at a crossroads, to look away or to descend deeper into the darkness where these stories refuse to stay buried. Power thrives on invisibility. It doesn't just hide its sins. It rewrites the rules so that its sins become invisible by definition. In Willow Creek, Alabama, the machinery of control was precise and ruthless. The law, the church, the social order, all instruments carefully tuned to silence, protect, and perpetuate. Enslaved women had no rights. Their bodies were commodities. Their voices were suppressed beneath layers of fear and violence. Any challenge to this system was not just discouraged. It was met with swift and brutal retribution. Imagine a world where accusing a white man of anything was a crime worse than any actual offense. The very notion of consent was meaningless. The enslaved were property, and as property, they were stripped of agency. If a man desired a woman's body, the law was his shield, the community his accomplice. The children born from these acts were seen not as people, but as assets: more labor, more wealth, more proof of ownership. And so the fathers remained unnamed, not because no one knew, but because everyone knew exactly who they were and what silence meant. Dr. Thorne's discovery wasn't just a medical mystery. It was a mirror reflecting the systemic corruption at the heart of the South. A corruption that wasn't accidental but deliberate, designed to protect wealth, status, and a twisted social order. The consequences for the mothers were devastating. To speak the truth was to invite punishment. Separation from children sailed to distant plantations, physical violence, or death. To protect their children, these women bore silence like a second skin. Meanwhile, the men who fathered these children maintained their place atop the social pyramid, their reputations untarnished, their power absolute. But power's greatest weapon isn't force. It's control of the story. By erasing the fathers, by silencing the mothers, by hiding the children, the system erased the crime itself. And the community? It looked the other way, because acknowledging the truth would shatter the fragile myth of order. It would demand justice that none were prepared to deliver. And so the truth lived only in the quiet despair of those who dared to remember. Tonight, I ask you to pause and reflect. How many systems in your own life depend on similar silences? What truths have you been taught to ignore? Type this phrase in the comments right now, twice. Silence protects the guilty. Do it. Seal in your mind. Because recognition is the first step to power. The descent continues. Silence protects the guilty. Remember those words. They're not just a statement. They are a key that unlocks the darkest doors in history and within ourselves. Dr. Thorne's nights grew restless. The faces of those 17 girls haunted his dreams, their eyes questioning, accusing. Yet by day he was trapped. The system offered him no refuge, no ally. The town of Willow Creek was a fortress of denial, built on mutual complicity. Everyone knew, yet no one spoke. Behind the polite facades of church pews and saloons, the truth was buried beneath layers of fear and greed. The plantation owners, their wives, and even some of the enslaved, each played a role in maintaining the illusion. To break that silence was to risk unraveling the entire fabric of their existence. Thorne considered his options. To speak out was to become a target. To act was to play a dangerous game against a force with far more resources, far more influence. The law was no friend to truth in this world. It was a weapon wielded to enforce silence. His growing anger battled with his fear. Could he find a way to expose the pattern without destroying himself? Could knowledge be a weapon, or was it a curse that would consume him? Meanwhile, the children, those living proof of abuse and betrayal, were growing in silence. Their identities stolen, their futures bound to secrets no one dared name. This was not just history. It was a living, breathing system of control that shaped bloodlines and destinies. And behind it all was a man, Alastair Finch, whose fiery red hair was the scarlet thread weaving these secrets together. But Finch was untouchable, a king in his domain, surrounded by loyal subjects who owed their wealth, status, and survival to his will. The truth was a poison he carefully diluted, a shadow he never fully revealed. In this world, power meant choosing who would live in light and who would be buried in darkness. As you sit here now, listening, feeling the weight of these revelations, understand this: the story is not over. The deeper you go, the more you realize how many layers of control and corruption lie beneath the surface of what we call civilization. The system teaches us to obey, to forget, to accept. But tonight, you are beginning to see what they never wanted you to know. And once you see it, there is no turning back. The very anatomy of control in Willow Creek was a masterclass in psychological warfare, disguised as everyday life. The enslaved women, trapped in bodies owned by others, bore the silent burden of this brutal calculus. Their pain wasn't just physical, it was the unbearable weight of invisibility. You have to understand, in this system, motherhood was both a blessing and a curse. Children were property, but they were also symbols. Each birth was a reminder of the tangled web of power and violation. The animal-faced children, as they were cruelly labeled, became living proof of the unspoken horrors that defined the plantation economy. Their existence was a threat to the carefully crafted myth of racial purity and moral superiority that the white ruling class clung to like a shield. But there was a deeper terror. These children embodied the failure of the system to control everything perfectly. Biology refused to be contained by laws or social contracts. It rebelled in faces that looked wrong, in hair the color of fire. Dr. Thorne's ledger was more than a record. It was a map of a secret war. A war fought not with guns or armies, but with silence, fear, and erasure. He documented the dates, the names, the physical anomalies, but behind every line was a story of betrayal, survival, and shattered innocence. Yet, for every child recorded, how many vanished without trace? How many were sold away to distant plantations, their existence scrubbed from memory? How many women were punished for daring to carry these truths? And the community, some complicit, others terrified, chose to look away. Because acknowledging these crimes meant confronting the very foundations of their society. It meant risking everything for a truth that had no protection. This is why the fathers were never named. because naming them would mean naming the system itself. The men behind the veil of respectability, the men like Alastair Finch, were architects of this nightmare. Their power was built on violation and silence. Their legacy stained with the lives they claimed as property. But power's grip is never absolute. Even the darkest secrets can crack under pressure. Tonight, as you listen, know this. You stand on the edge of that fracture. The system is still alive, still protecting itself in new forms. Understanding the past is your weapon, because real power comes from seeing what others refuse to see. And that is the beginning of true freedom. There is a calculated precision to how these secrets were hidden. The plantations operated like closed ecosystems, self-sustaining machines of control and denial. Every aspect of life was monitored, manipulated, and orchestrated to maintain the illusion of order. Doctors like Thorne were carefully controlled, trusted only to tend wounds and deliver babies, but never to question the invisible lines they crossed. Midwives knew better than to speak out. They were the silent witnesses, bound by fear and survival. But even within this cage, subtle acts of resistance flickered. Whispers in the night, coded messages passed between mothers, a look exchanged in the shadows. Small rebellions of the human spirit against an overwhelming darkness. Yet, the men who controlled the plantations understood the power of fear better than hope. They enforced silence not just through laws and threats, but by controlling what could be seen, heard, and believed. The fathers of those children, men like Alastair Finch, were cloaked in layers of respectability and influence. Their hands never dirted by public scandal. Their actions were concealed behind a wall of wealth and connections. They owned the courts, the churches, the social clubs. Their reach extended far beyond the cotton fields. This was a system designed to make the powerful invisible and the powerless voiceless. Dr. Thorne's internal battle wasn't just about truth, it was about his own complicity. By remaining silent, was he a healer or a participant in the crime? Was his knowledge a burden or a weapon? The ledger became his confession, a record of everything no one else dared to admit. And now, as you listen, you carry a piece of that burden too. Because knowledge like this changes a man. It forces him to confront the darkest parts of history and himself. It awakens a hunger for justice, for understanding, for power over systems designed to keep him small. But remember this, the descent into truth is a path only the brave walk. And the deeper you go, the more you realize how carefully the system protects itself. The next revelation will peel back another layer. Brace yourself. By now, you should understand that this story isn't merely about distant plantations or forgotten people. It's about the architecture of power itself, a blueprint repeated across centuries and continents. Wherever control is absolute and accountability is absent. The systematic erasure of these children's fathers was no accident. It was a deliberate act of institutional violence designed to preserve the social order. And the red-haired children? There was a visible crack in that order, a silent scream that could never be allowed to be heard. Alastair Finch wasn't just a man. He was a symbol of everything the system protected: wealth, privilege, unchallenged authority. His fiery hair was the brand burned onto this dark secret, a signature no one dared speak aloud. And here's what they hoped you'd never realize. Those children were not anomalies. They were evidence. Evidence of abuse, exploitation, and the grotesque machinery of racial and economic hierarchy. But what makes this even more chilling is the complicity required to maintain such a secret. Not just the perpetrators, but an entire community of enablers, judges, sheriffs, preachers, merchants, each with a stake in the silence. Even the church, often seen as a beacon of morality, was a player in this game. Reverend Josiah Blackwell, whose sermons preached submission and obedience, traveled between plantations, his words reinforcing the chains of control. Power's greatest weapon is the transformation of truth into myth, turning injustice into destiny, silence into obedience. The enslaved mothers bore the double burden of their bodies and their secrets. To question was to invite destruction. To speak was to be silenced. Dr. Thorne watched helplessly as the system consumed those around him, leaving only shadows and whispers. But the shadows cannot hide forever. You listening now are part of the rupture. And before we plunge deeper, I want you to lock this in. Comment this phrase below twice. Truth shatters chains. Type it now. Seal your intent. Because the journey into forbidden knowledge demands commitment. And as we go further, the true cost of silence will become impossible to ignore. The deeper Dr. Thorne delved into his records, the more he realized how the system had engineered a labyrinth of deception, one where truth was a weapon wielded only by the powerful, and silence was the currency paid by the powerless. Each birth of those red-haired, pale-skinned girls was a thread in a vast tapestry of corruption that stretched far beyond Willow Creek. The pattern repeated itself across counties, states, even decades, an unbroken chain of exploitation cloaked by fear and social order. What makes this tale disturbingly relevant is not just the past, but the blueprint it offers for modern systems of control. Institutions today still rely on erasing inconvenient truths, rewriting history, and silencing dissent. Thorne's torment was not just over the identity of the fathers, but over the complicity of everyone who benefited from this silence. He had seen firsthand how justice was bought, how laws were twisted, how morality was a mask worn by those who wielded power without conscience. His own position as a healer trapped him in an impossible bind. He was bound by the Hippocratic oath to save lives, yet powerless to save those caught in a system designed to destroy them. The ledger became his dark confession, a record not just of births, but of a society's sin. And as the shadows of those plantations lengthened each evening, so too did the shadows in Thorne's mind deepen. But this is not just a story about a broken past. It's a warning, a reminder of how power corrupts, how systems perpetuate themselves through fear and denial, and how the cost of silence is paid by the innocent. If you've been following closely, it's time to ask yourself, what truths are you ignoring in your own world? What secrets are hidden beneath the surface of your reality? Because the knowledge you now possess isn't just history. It's a call to awareness. And awareness is the first step toward breaking the cycle. Keep your eyes open. The next revelation will reveal how far this darkness reaches. Alastair Finch's name alone carried weight in Willow Creek, a man whose influence was woven into the very fabric of the town's economy, law, and society. He was not merely a cotton broker. He was a silent kingpin of an empire built on stolen lives and hidden atrocities. His fiery red hair was unmistakable, like a beacon that no one dared follow too closely. Behind his booming voice and charismatic laughter, there lay a darker truth, a man who wielded his power with ruthless precision, ensuring no one would question his authority or his sins. Thorne's suspicions crystallized during one meeting in Finch's ornate office, where the afternoon sun caught the copper strands of his hair like flames. In that moment, all the puzzle pieces converged: the red hair, the pattern of births, the disappearances of fathers. But Finch was careful, too careful. His public persona was impeccable. A respected church elder, a generous donor, a pillar of the community. The very embodiment of Southern gentility and success. This was the mask that protected him. A mask designed to deflect scrutiny, to silence suspicion. Yet beneath that mask was a predator. A man who used his power not only to exploit but to erase evidence, to manipulate witnesses, to orchestrate a web of silence, so complete it seemed impenetrable. And it wasn't just Finch acting alone. There was a network, the sheriff who turned a blind eye, the preacher who preached submission, the merchants who profited from the plantations, and the politicians who upheld the system. A system designed to protect men like Finch, to perpetuate a cycle of abuse that was as old as the plantations themselves. Dr. Thorne, burdened by his knowledge, realized he was up against more than one man. He was facing an entire structure of oppression, and that realization was terrifying, because power like that does not fade quietly. It fights back. It destroys anyone who threatens its existence. And now, you have come too far to turn back. The truth is no longer a secret. It's a weapon, and how you choose to wield it will define you. Stay with me. The deeper revelations are coming. The system that protected men like Alastair Finch was built on more than just wealth and influence. It was engineered through psychological manipulation, fear, and social conditioning. This was a society where power operated invisibly, embedded within every institution, every custom, every whispered conversation. The enslaved women who bore the children of these men were trapped in a web of terror. Their bodies were battlegrounds, their silence a prison. To speak the truth was to risk everything: their lives, their families, their very existence. Yet, even in this darkness, there were cracks, small, fragile acts of defiance. Mothers who clung to their children with fierce love, despite knowing the world saw them as property. Neighbors who offered quiet support, risking suspicion and punishment. Dr. Thorne saw these moments. He witnessed the courage it took to survive under the weight of such oppression. But he also saw how the system crushed resistance, how fear was weaponized to keep the status quo intact. And this fear extended beyond the plantations. The white community, too, was trapped by the unspoken rules that demanded loyalty to race and class above justice and humanity. The fear of truth was a shackle on all sides. Thorne's ledger, filled with coded entries and careful notes, became a testament to this struggle, a silent scream against a world built to ignore suffering. He understood that exposing the truth would not only endanger him, but could ignite chaos. The town's fragile order would crumble, revealing the rotten core beneath the polished facade. But could he continue to live with this knowledge locked away? Could he bear the weight of complicity? This question haunted him like a specter. And it must haunt you too, because the legacy of silence and control is not confined to history. It echoes in the systems of power that still shape our world. Your awakening to this truth is the first act of rebellion, and the path ahead demands courage unlike any you have known. Prepare yourself. The revelations will only grow darker. As Dr. Thorne's obsession deepened, he began to map the connections between men of influence in Willow Creek, each link revealing a pattern of deliberate cruelty hidden beneath layers of civility. The red-haired children were just the surface. Below was a network of manipulation and calculated silence. Alistair Finch was at the center, but the true power lay in the system he commanded. The sheriff turned a blind eye. The preacher's sermons preached obedience. The judges handed down sentences that upheld white supremacy, all part of the machinery that ensured the perpetuation of control. Thorne realized that this system was not unique to Willow Creek. It was replicated across the South, a widespread culture of abuse protected by law and social consensus. And the consequences were devastating. The enslaved women bore scars that could not be healed, children born into a world that denied their very existence, communities shattered by secrets too dangerous to speak. The horror was compounded by the knowledge that no justice awaited them. The law was not a shield for the oppressed. It was a weapon of their oppressors. This was institutionalized violence, hidden in plain sight. But the truth, no matter how deeply buried, has a way of surfacing. And tonight, as you listen, you hold a piece of that truth, a truth that breaks chains. It is your responsibility now to carry this knowledge, to question the stories you've been told, and to see the systems around you with unflinching clarity. Because the price of ignorance is far greater than the pain of truth, and the path of awakening is neither easy nor comfortable, but it is necessary. As we continue, prepare to confront the darkest depths of this story, the consequences, the cover-ups, and the echoes that still resonate today. You are no longer a bystander. You are a witness, and witnesses are dangerous to those who hide in the shadows. The weight of this knowledge settled heavily on Dr. Thorne's conscience like a storm cloud threatening to burst. The ledger he carried was more than a book of records. It was a manifesto of suppressed truths and unspoken horrors. He understood the stakes. To reveal what he knew was to invite ruin. His career, his safety, and even his life could be at risk. But to stay silent was to be complicit in a system that devoured innocence without remorse. Thorne wrestled with his conscience in the quiet hours of the night, pacing his small room while shadows played on the walls. His mind was a battleground where the desire for justice clashed with the fear of retaliation. He imagined the women, each mother, each child, trapped in the relentless machinery of power. Their stories echoed in his mind, silent cries for recognition, for humanity, for justice. Yet the very society that condemned them was held together by fear and denial. The white men who ruled Willow Creek were masters of control, masters of erasure. They ensured that no whisper of scandal could break their carefully constructed image. The red-haired children were anomalies that threatened to unravel the narrative. And so they were hidden, dismissed, silenced. But even in this darkness, there were signs of fragility. The ledger itself was a fissure in the system, a crack where light might eventually seep through. For you listening now, this is your moment of reckoning. The truths you uncover today will challenge what you thought was real. They will force you to question loyalties, confront uncomfortable realities, and embrace the power of awareness. Because knowledge is not just power, it is liberation. But liberation demands sacrifice. The journey is just beginning. Brace yourself. The next revelations will strip away more layers of deception. What Dr. Thorne faced wasn't just a local secret. It was the embodiment of a larger, insidious reality that had been woven into the fabric of America's foundation. This wasn't merely about slavery. It was about how systems of power normalize cruelty, how institutions silence dissent, and how history itself is rewritten to protect the privileged. The red-haired girls, with their pale skin and fiery crowns, were living proof that beneath the surface of order, chaos brewed. Their existence was a glaring contradiction to the mythology of purity and control that the elite propagated. The men who fathered these children did not just violate bodies. They violated truth, rewriting narratives to erase their sins. Their silence was enforced by a code of complicity, upheld by the very laws and customs that claimed to protect society. Thorne realized that the roots of this deception ran deep, tangled in politics, economics, religion, and social norms. It was a fortress built to withstand scrutiny. But every fortress has a weakness, and a ledger was a key, a dangerous, potent key that could unlock doors no one wanted opened. For those who wield power, control is maintained by shaping perception, by deciding which stories get told and which are buried in silence. But you, watching this now, have the power to change that, to break the cycle, to question the narratives you've been fed. Because history is not fixed. It is shaped by those who tell it, and by those brave enough to listen. The journey you're on is not comfortable. It's dark, it's unsettling, but it is necessary. Because confronting these truths is the only way to dismantle the systems built on lies. Prepare yourself. The next layers will expose the mechanics of this hidden empire of cruelty. And the deeper we go, the harder it becomes to ignore. Dr. Thorne's growing awareness brought him to a crossroads. He knew that to expose Alastair Finch and the network of power that protected him was to risk everything. Yet the burden of silence was crushing, an ever-tightening noose around his conscience. He considered the lives caught in this web, the mothers who carried the scars of violation, the children born into a world that refused to acknowledge them, and the community that tacitly endorsed this atrocity through silence. The complicity extended far beyond individuals. It was woven into the legal system, the churches, the economy, and the very culture of the South. Every institution worked in concert to erase these girls' fathers from history, to maintain a fragile illusion of order and superiority. Thorne understood that confronting this beast required more than evidence. It demanded courage, strategy, and allies. But who could he trust? In a town where every handshake masked a secret, every smile concealed a lie, the line between friend and foe blurred, and the cost of misstep was deadly. Still, within Thorne stirred a resolve, an understanding that some truths were worth risking everything for. He began to seek out subtle ways to protect the mothers and children, to record their stories in code, and to plant seeds of awareness in quiet corners. This was not a war he could win outright. It was a slow, dangerous struggle against a system designed to survive. And now, this struggle reaches beyond Willow Creek. It is a reflection of every society that chooses power over justice, silence over truth. Your role in this is clear. You're the witness, the keeper of forbidden knowledge, and the path you walk will shape the future. Stay vigilant. The darkest revelations are still ahead. The clock was ticking, but Dr. Thorne knew time was a luxury he didn't possess. Every day that passed was another day the secret festered in the shadows, poisoning the lives of those who had no voice. He saw the toll it took, not just physically but spiritually, on the enslaved women and their children. He observed mothers trying to shield their daughters from a world that saw them as less than human, a world that denied their existence and erased their fathers' names. The children, with their fiery hair and ghostly skin, became living symbols of a crime that dared not be named. But beneath their pale exteriors was a fierce, unspoken resilience. These girls were survivors. They carried a legacy that defied the oppressive silence, even if the world refused to acknowledge it. Thorne's internal battle mirrored the external one. His professional duties clashed with his moral compass, forcing him to operate in the shadows, recording truths in secret, watching, waiting, and fearing the day when the system's grip might tighten even more. The men in power, Alastair Finch and his allies, were not just powerful, they were ruthless. Any threat to their dominion was met with intimidation, violence, or worse. The system was a fortress built not just of laws, but of fear. And yet, fear was not absolute. The ledger was more than just a record. It was a spark, a challenge thrown into the darkness. And now, the question moves beyond Thorn and Willow Creek. It moves to you. What will you do with the truths you've uncovered? Will you be a silent witness, or will you become a catalyst for change? Remember this: true power lies not in domination, but in awakening. An awakening is the first step toward freedom. The next revelations will expose how deep the rot spreads and how it continues to shape our world today. Stay with me. The truth demands nothing less. As Dr. Thorne delved deeper into the tangled web of power and secrecy, he uncovered something even more unsettling: evidence that the cycle of abuse was not random or chaotic, but meticulously orchestrated. Alastair Finch wasn't simply acting on impulse. He was part of a deliberate design, a system engineered to perpetuate control through systematic violation and enforced silence. The plantations were not isolated fortresses, but nodes in a vast network, each connected by economic interests, political alliances, and social compacts. This network ensured that the sins of men like Finch were never exposed, that the voices of the oppressed were crushed before they could rise. Thorne's ledger became a map, revealing how power operated through silence and fear, how institutions protected their own while sacrificing the vulnerable. The realization struck him with bone-chilling clarity. This was not just history. It was a blueprint still active today. The same mechanisms of control, manipulation, erasure, complicity were embedded in modern systems, hidden beneath the veneer of progress and justice. To confront this truth is to challenge the foundations of power itself. And power does not relinquish control willingly. It fights back with every tool at its disposal: deception, intimidation, division. But knowledge is the weapon that cuts through the darkness. And you now hold that weapon. Midway through our journey, I want you to lock this phrase in your mind and comment below. Truth is the fiercest rebellion. Say it twice out loud or in your mind. By doing so, you anchor this transformation, sealing your commitment to seeing beyond the lies and breaking the chains of control. Because awakening is a revolution, and revolution begins with truth. With that phrase echoing in your mind, we descend even further into the machinery of control, the insidious forces that sustain the hidden empire Alastair Finch represented. It wasn't enough to simply father children in secret. Those children, their mothers, and the very truth of their existence needed to be erased from history. The mechanisms of erasure were sophisticated. Legal systems that refused to acknowledge the humanity of enslaved people, social codes that punished any hint of dissent, and cultural narratives that glorified the oppressors while vilifying the oppressed. Dr. Thorne observed how this pattern repeated again and again. Every attempt to expose the truth was met with swift and brutal suppression. It was a dance of shadows, a constant push and pull where those in power maintained dominance by controlling not just bodies but minds. The community around Willow Creek played its role. Neighbors who looked the other way, clergy who preached submission as virtue, and officials who enforced laws designed to keep the oppressed powerless. But what truly sustained this system was fear. Fear of exposure, fear of upheaval, fear of losing control. This fear was not confined to the enslaved or the oppressed. It gripped the entire social order, binding everyone in a web of silent complicity. Yet even in this darkness, there were cracks, small acts of courage, secret alliances, whispered stories passed down through generations. These fractures are the foundation of resistance. They remind us that power, no matter how absolute it seems, is never invincible. And it is in these cracks that your power lies. To see, to question, to speak, to be the ripple that becomes a wave. Because the fight for truth is never over. And every revelation brings us closer to breaking the cycle. Dr. Thorne's journey into the heart of darkness revealed not only individual acts of cruelty, but a systemic, almost ritualistic pattern of control, one that transcended Willow Creek and stretched across the South like a silent plague. This wasn't just about the children with red hair and pale skin. It was about a society built on layers of deceit and psychological domination, where power was maintained by controlling narratives and erasing inconvenient truths. Every institution, from the courthouse to the church, acted as a cog in this machine. They reinforced hierarchies, dictated who had value, and ensured that the oppressed remained invisible. The very fabric of this society depended on silence, on a collective agreement to ignore the suffering beneath the surface. And that silence was enforced through fear, fear of violence, fear of exile, fear of losing everything. But fear is fragile. It cracks under pressure. In Thorne's ledger was a crack that threatened to shatter the entire facade. As you listen now, understand that this story is more than history. It's a mirror reflecting the structures of power that persist today. The same systems that protected Alastair Finch and his secrets are still at work, cloaked in new forms but operating on the same principles. Your awakening is a challenge to those systems, a disruption of their carefully maintained order. And with that knowledge comes responsibility. To question, to resist, to seek justice in a world designed to obscure it. Because the darkness that once ruled Willow Creek still lurks in the shadows. But it's no longer invincible, and neither are you. Thorne's investigations unearthed a truth more damning than he had imagined. The legacy of those enslaved girls with fiery red hair was not just a local anomaly. It was a systemic weapon wielded by the elite to maintain control through generations. Each child born in secret was a living reminder of a brutal hierarchy enforced by law, violence, and silence. Yet, beyond the pain, these children represented a fracture in the illusion of purity and power, a dangerous fracture that threatened to expose the rot beneath the surface. The elite's response was predictably ruthless: cover-ups, intimidation, and the careful rewriting of narratives. But history does not forget. It may be buried, distorted, or denied, but it waits patiently for those who dare to unearth it. And now, you stand at the precipice of that unearthing. The knowledge you hold is potent. It can destabilize falsehoods and crack open the carefully constructed facades of power. But such power is double-edged. It demands wisdom. It demands courage. Because those who benefit from these lies will fight to protect them. Their resistance will be fierce. But your resolve must be fiercer. This is not just a story from 1847 Alabama. It is a blueprint for understanding the systems that still shape our world. And understanding is the first step to dismantling. Prepare yourself. The darkest, most uncomfortable truths lie just ahead. As Thorne pieced together the puzzle, he realized the true scale of the conspiracy was almost unimaginable. This wasn't a matter of isolated acts by rogue individuals. It was a systematic campaign by a network of men who wielded their power with brutal precision. Alastair Finch was not just a man. He was a symbol, a representation of how wealth and influence corrupted the very soul of a community. Every plantation, every courthouse, every church was complicit, bound by invisible chains of greed, fear, and self-preservation. And at the center of it all was a chilling indifference to human suffering, a callous calculus that measured lives in terms of profit and control. Thorne's quiet determination transformed into a burning need to expose this rot. But he knew the cost would be high. The system did not tolerate whistleblowers. It crushed them. But the ledger was more than just records. It was a testament to the resilience of truth, a beacon in a world drowned by lies. Now, as you stand on the edge of this revelation, understand the stakes are as high now as they were then. The forces that enforce silence have not disappeared. They have evolved. But so must you. Armed with this knowledge, you possess the power to challenge the narratives and disrupt the control. Remember, history belongs to those who dare to tell it, and the future belongs to those who refuse to be silenced. Dr. Thorne's secret ledger became a symbol of resistance, a fragile but potent weapon against a system that thrived on erasure. With every entry, he documented not just births, but the silent cries of those erased from history. His meticulous records painted a portrait of systematic abuse, implicating men who wielded power like a weapon, their actions shielded by layers of social and legal complicity. But Thorne was no hero in the traditional sense. He was a man shackled by fear and doubt, aware that every step toward truth could trigger a cascade of consequences, not just for himself, but for the women and children whose lives hung in the balance. He wrestled with the question that haunts every whistleblower. When does silence become betrayal? The ledger was a burden and a beacon. It was proof that the unspoken was real, that beneath the veneer of civility lurked a darkness few dared to confront. Yet even as he pondered his next move, the weight of his knowledge began to isolate him. Friends grew distant, whispers followed his name, and the eyes of the town seemed to bore into his soul. But in isolation, a new clarity emerged. Thorne realized that true change would not come from one man alone. It would require a reckoning, a collective awakening. And that awakening begins with you, because knowledge is contagious. Truth spreads like wildfire once it takes hold. You are part of this awakening, and the ledger story is far from over. Prepare yourself, because the revelations that follow will challenge everything you thought you knew about power, control, and the price of silence. The deeper Dr. Thorne dug, the more he realized how the illusion of control was maintained through layers of psychological manipulation and cultural conditioning. The women who bore these children lived in constant fear, not only of their owners, but of a society that branded them invisible and unworthy of protection. Their stories, whispered in hushed tones, were warnings and prayers wrapped in sorrow. Yet these women were more than victims. They were survivors who navigated a brutal landscape with fierce resilience. Thorne's ledger didn't just reveal names and dates. It captured fragments of these women's lives, their courage etched between the lines. But the men who held power ensured these fragments were shattered, erased, rewritten into silence. The system was designed to crush hope, to prevent any spark from igniting rebellion. Religion preached submission, law enforced oppression, and social norms demanded compliance. This web of control was psychological as much as physical, shaping minds to accept bondage as destiny. Thorne saw the invisible chains that bound both oppressors and oppressed, chains forged by fear, ignorance, and silence. Your role in this story is to recognize these chains in the world today, to see how control operates beneath the surface, masking itself as order and tradition. To understand that breaking free begins with awareness, and awareness demands courage, because every truth uncovered chips away at the fortress of lies, and every lie exposed weakens the grip of power. You have the power to be that catalyst, the spark that lights the darkness. The evidence in Thorne's ledger revealed a haunting truth. The children born with red hair and pale skin were more than genetic anomalies. They were living proof of a power so absolute. It corrupted bloodlines and shattered families without consequence. This power was sustained by a calculated invisibility, a shadow network that operated beyond the reach of law and morality. The fathers, men like Alastair Finch, were shielded by wealth, influence, and a community complicit in their silence. Thorne saw how this system weaponized silence to maintain control, turning victims into ghosts and history into a lie. But the ledger was a rebellion. It challenged the erasure, recorded the erased, and in doing so, it threatened the very foundations of the social order. The danger was clear. Those who sought to preserve their power would stop at nothing to destroy the ledger and anyone associated with it. Thorne's dilemma became a microcosm of a larger truth. Power is maintained not just by force, but by controlling the narrative, by deciding what can be seen and what must remain hidden. And this control extends far beyond Willow Creek. It is a blueprint replicated in every corner of the world where truth threatens the powerful. Your awakening is an act of defiance. By holding these truths, by refusing to look away, you confront the invisible chains that bind us all. The question remains, what will you do with this knowledge? Will you let the ledger's rebellion fade into silence? Or will you carry its fire forward? Thorne's knowledge isolated him, yet it also forged a new kind of strength, a grim determination that truth must outlive fear. He understood that the ledger was more than a document. It was a legacy of resistance, a beacon for those brave enough to face the darkness. But exposing this hidden horror required allies, a network beyond Willow Creek's borders, people willing to challenge the very foundations of power. The story of the red-haired girls was no longer just about the past. It was a call to arms against all systems built on exploitation and silence. Every name, every birth recorded was a crack in the facade, a fracture in a myth of invincibility. Power thrives on obedience and ignorance, but when the veil lifts, it trembles. And as you listen now, know this. You are part of that awakening. You carry the legacy forward. You hold the key to dismantling the cycle, because true power belongs to those who dare to know. Now, you stand at the edge of this forbidden knowledge, carrying the weight and the responsibility it demands. The story of Willow Creek and the red-haired girls is not just a relic of history. It is a living mirror reflecting the hidden forces shaping our world today. The system that protected men like Alastair Finch did not vanish. It evolved, hidden behind new names, new faces, new institutions, but still fueled by the same thirst for control, the same appetite for silence. Your awakening is the spark that can ignite change. But remember, truth is a dangerous ally. It challenges comfort, threatens power, and demands sacrifice. To carry this knowledge is to step into a lifelong battle, one fought not with weapons, but with vigilance, courage, and unwavering resolve. The path ahead is dark and perilous, but within darkness lies power. Power to see what others refuse. Power to speak when others stay silent. Power to break the chains forged by centuries of lies. This is your calling. Your revolution begins now. Speak the truth, break the silence, and become the force history never saw coming.